the Career Queue, we're talking with Justin Meads. Justin has 20 years experience working as a software engineer for Fortune 500 companies. For the last 10 years, Justin has lived in a number of different U.S. states and in a few different countries, all while working remotely.
This is the Career Queue, the podcast focused on helping you navigate the signals in your career to keep you growing and moving forward in business and in life. Here's today's host, Dana Redmond.
Justin, thanks so much for talking with us today.
Oh, thanks for having me on.
We are going to be talking about working remotely. So tell me, where are you calling from today?
I am calling you from Birmingham, Alabama.
And we are here in Seattle, Washington. So this is a great example of the working remotely.
Exactly.
I know you've worked in a number of different states and a number of different countries, and even maybe some different roles within that. Can you give me a quick rundown on how many different remote roles have you had and in what different places?
I think I've worked for 3 different companies now remotely. I've worked, from Atlanta. I was in Canada for a couple of years, back to Utah. We went overseas to Belgium, and when I first went over to Belgium, I tried to work remotely. My company was all for it. They jumped through some paperwork to make sure that it would all work out, but with a 6-hour time change, usually by the time I wanted to be done with the day, they were just coming online. So I gave it up then, and then we moved back, and like I said, we're in Birmingham, Alabama now, and working remotely here.
Great. Well, I'd love to just start out and tell me a little bit about your roles that you've been able to work remotely. How did you decide that you wanted to, work from home or work remotely?
So I'm a software engineer and have been doing that for most of my career. And I never specifically went about looking for a job working remotely. My wife and I are corporate nomads, my family is, and have moved every 3 to 4 years pretty consistently for my wife's job. And I was working for AT&T in Atlanta almost a decade ago. And at the time, we were working from home 2 or 3 days a week. That was just part of the package that they had. And with Atlanta traffic, that became very appealing because the office was downtown and most of us lived out in the burbs, and it was hour-plus commute. So originally it wasn't like a full-time work-at-home arrangement. It was a day or 2 here, maybe 3 days a week. After doing that for about 2 years, we found out that my wife was going to be transferred to Canada. And so I went to my boss and said, hey, just found out we've got this move coming up, and I'm going to have to resign. We're going to Canada. And my boss said, hey, you've been doing an awesome job 2 or 3 days a week at home. Why don't you just work full-time from home? And I thought, okay, that sounds like a great deal, because we were moving to a town, I think it was maybe 5,000 people in Canada, so I wasn't going to have an opportunity to find a good job. The nearest town was probably 70 miles away, so it would have been quite a commute had I had to do that every day. So I kind of just stumbled into full-time remote work and have been doing that pretty much consistently for the last 10 years.
Wow, that's great. It seems like that was a great opportunity for both you and and your company at that time, for them to be able to keep you on, right? And then, but for you to be able to find work, if you're moving to such a small town. Well, tell me a little bit about when you first started that. What were the parameters of that relationship? What did that arrangement look like?
They were pretty loose with me. I think it was basically I had to come into the office quarterly is what they wanted me to do, was to spend a week quarterly in the office. And then other than that, it was just full-time remote, basically doing the same stuff I did before when I was going in 2 or 3 days a week.
So what does your typical workday look like? Because you're still working remotely now, correct? And so this current job you have, did you specifically go out looking for a remote role now? Or how did the current role you're in come about?
Well, and actually with the current job I wasn't even looking for a job, let alone one that was remote. We were a second time out of country. We moved back to the States, and when I moved back, I found some old contacts and was able to get another job back at AT&T, this time, again, doing full-time remote, but out of a different office. I was doing that, and I went to a conference and had ran into a colleague I'd worked with 10 years before, and in the conference they were talking about all these cool technologies, cool things going on, and my former colleague was saying, oh yeah, my company's doing this, yeah, my company does that. I'm like, oh, well, if your company is so cool, are they hiring? And he said, well, actually they are. I'm like, oh, really? Cool. And I send him my information and said, hey, will you forward this on? And he said, yeah, I will, but I think they want somebody that's going to be local. And this company that I work for now is one state away from where I am currently. And he said, do you think you'd be able to relocate? And I said, no, with my wife's job, we can't do that. And he's like, okay, well, I'll forward it on, but I can't promise you anything. So he did that. His manager called me, gave me an interview, and, asked me if I could relocate. And I said, no, I can't do that. And he said, okay, you'll hear back from me. And a couple weeks later, he called and said, hey, we've decided to bring back a different employee that we've had on full-time, but you're the top of the list, and we're going to have another opening. So I assumed I would never hear from this guy again. I thought that was just the nice brush off. Mm-hmm. And then a month later, I get this call, and he's like, hey, this is Ron. We wanted to talk to you. And I'm like, who is this? He's like, yeah, we want you to come on full-time. And the agreement that I worked out with them is that I'd come into the office for 2 straight weeks when I first started, just to get familiar with the project, come up to speed, learn the people on the project. And then the ongoing commitment is that I go into the office 2 days a week, every other week. So I'm working from home 8 out of 10 days.
Got it. And so in that, did you set up that parameters? Like when they said, hey, we want to offer you this role, were you like, well, great, it's got to be a work from home? Or where did that sort of come up in that interview process?
It was exactly that. They had asked me if I could relocate, and I said, no, I can't do that. And they said, okay, well, let's try to figure out how to work this out. And that's when we went back and forth, and I'm like, how about 2 days every other week? And he said, okay. But then that's when they came back with, that sounds okay going forward, but I want you 2 weeks in the office. And I said, okay, that seems pretty fair.
Right. That makes sense, right? From sort of both sides, right? They need you in the office, learning the people, learning the processes, learning the tools, which is probably one of the most challenging things to do as you are onboarding, right? So during your onboarding period, be in there, be around other people. But then, for the rest of the time, just those couple days every couple of weeks. Interesting. Okay. So what is your typical workday like now? Give me your typical workday.
I am a morning person. So most people would think what I do is horrific, but I get up at 5:20 in the morning, pretty much every morning, and by 5:30 I'm dialed in and I'm working. And, first thing in the morning it's quiet, there's nobody in the office, so I'm reviewing other people's codes. I'm trying to figure out tasks for everybody to do for the coming days. And once I get that knocked out, I'll start coding. We have what they call a stand-up meeting, which is not so stand-up-y, every day at 11, and I'll do that. And then usually the other thing I do every day is before our stand-up meeting, I'll take an hour for myself and go do exercise. Come back fresh, reinvigorated, ready to work some more, do my stand-up meeting, have some lunch, then I'll work for the afternoon, and generally by the time my son gets home from school at 3:30 every afternoon, I'm done for the day and able to do whatever we want to for the rest of that day.
Nice. Well, without being in the office, how do you ensure that you're aware of sort of what's happening with the team or what's happening on the project?
Actually, to be honest, a lot of the day-to-day politics I am out of the loop on. And, work-wise, we use collaboration tools like Slack for, messaging. We use Jira to track all of the tasks that we're working on. And generally with those two things, I'm able to stay on top of any of the work that's coming along. We're trying to plan out a release in advance, which is a couple of months out. So we'll create Jira tickets for all that. We'll manage that, track that. And so I'm able to stay on top of the actual work and releases that need to be done pretty well. But I do lose some of the, what's going on, the scuttle in the office, what's happening on other projects. I don't get a ton of that until those days that I go into the office. And then I'll find out, everybody's apparently mad at this person. I didn't realize that. And I don't know. It's kind of, that stuff's important to the job, but I don't miss being in that day to day. I think that I'm one of the happier people on the project, and I think part of that is because I don't know about all that minutia and who's mad at who and why they're frustrated with this. As long as we're getting regular tasks, we're getting the release done, I'm just happy. I'm like, everything's cool.
How much of your time do you think that you have to spend actively managing your relationships or that piece because you're working remotely? I mean, are there things you think you do or time you have to spend now that you wouldn't if you were in the office because you would just happen to walk by somebody, at the water cooler or at the coffee machine?
I don't spend a ton on my current project, and I think it is because I go in 2 days every other day. That gives me a lot of freedom. On other jobs where I've worked full-time remotely, I had another colleague that I was pretty good with friends with that we'd worked together for several years, and him and I would spend a half hour a day on the phone reviewing work, but then talking other work stuff to kind of help keep having a relationship, that I think made us more productive as a team. So, yeah, there was some of that when I was full-time remote, but with this current situation, in my day-to-day, I don't have to spend a lot of effort trying to kind of fill, myself into that. Doing our daily stand-up meeting, there's a fair amount of interaction. So actually what we could do is the first part of it, everybody goes around on the project, gives their status for the day. And the second part of it, we're allowed to, if we have questions for other remote workers or for people in the office, we're able to do those then. If I get a little piece of functionality working, lots of times I'll do a little demo and say, is this what you guys were thinking, and get feedback. And so I think that hour call a day is very beneficial.
That daily check-in is kind of a way for you to have that water cooler talk if you need it, sort of work-related, or that ability to lean across the cube and say, hey, can you check this out for me?
Exactly.
What sort of happens when you're in the office. So in your experience, are you generally the only remote person, or have you been on teams where everybody's remote?
I think talking about what makes it successful, and I think you have to work in an environment that is set up for remote working. I've never worked for a company where I was the only remote worker. When I was at AT&T, when I originally started there was several of us that were doing the 2 or 3 days a week in the office. But since then, 3 other people that I was on that team with are now full-time remote workers. So they kind of had that, with the 2 or 3 days a week at home, they kind of had that built in. On my current project that I'm on, we have a third-party contracting company that is full-time remote, and so I'm full-time remote. We have an employee that goes back and forth from the West Coast to the East Coast every week. So, yeah, I think there has to be kind of a culture of remote working in order for it to be successful.
And what does that culture of remote working look like? What are the things that you think just sort of become endemic or become habit, I guess, for companies if you have lots of people that work remotely?
I think, knowing that you're not going to have full availability all the time and being okay with that. Sometimes if you're working with different schedules, if we've got, like I said, we've got one person working on the West Coast, our team's on the East Coast. So there's a lot of times when, she's not, even out of bed before
right.
Other people are working on the East Coast. So you got to have some flexibility there. I think that's where, the good tools like Slack and stuff, you can leave them messages. Even crazy, we still do a little bit of email these days, not as much as we used to. Having the voice conferencing bridges available, having, the messaging clients, like I said, all of that, I think, rolls up into the tools is what's needed.
Right. Well, and it's so interesting, right, that it just has to become a thing that that you can't just lean across the cube, that you do have to leave messages or, sort of arrange a time to talk to somebody. So in a way, you almost have to be a bit more planful in your
right.
in how you're going to structure your work and what you're doing, I think. And then even I think so much of, just by default, making sure that every meeting has that conference call number. And there's a whole art, right, to being good on conference calls. And there's plenty of funny YouTube videos out there about the conference call, right? So, and these are just becoming so normal for us.
Right. I was going to say, kind of interesting. So on my current job, I'm right now in the last week transitioning to a different project at the same company. And on the old project, we did everything via just a voice phone bridge. That's all we used. On this new project, their daily stand-up is shorter. They don't have that second piece at the end where you get the question time back and forth. But theirs is all video-based. We're using Google Hangouts. And so there's me. A couple of my colleagues in the office work remotely at home a couple of days a week. On the days that they're not in the office, they're on Google Hangouts. Then we have the entire office in Atlanta that's on it, and then we have a third-party contractor. And I think there's 4 developers there as well that are on theirs, and we all get on Google Hangouts and go around and do our status. One of the things that I like about what our contract company is doing is they've got the Google Hangouts window, but then they have a mic that they pass from person to person, because lots of times, if you've just got like a laptop that a group of people staring at, it's hard to hear what, somebody 5 feet away from the laptop is saying. So I really like that they have this microphone that they pass from person to person as they're doing their status.
So they're getting really good at that piece, right? If there are multiple people in one room, they know that they need to communicate well with the other people that are listening and watching in, right? So that's great, because that doesn't always happen. You definitely get some of those where the conference room phone isn't working very well and you can't hear somebody, or they're sitting back off and you on the phone like, I can't hear you. Could you please speak up?
Exactly. And on the voice bridge on the project that I'm transitioning off of, that happens all the time. Almost every day somebody's like, okay, I can't hear what you're saying in the office, You are 25 feet from the mic, it feels like.
Yeah, so it can be so challenging. And it becomes the way that even the folks in the office, if you are somebody who's in the office and maybe that's your job and you go in 5 days a week, but then you interact with people who are working remotely or over phone bridges, you just have to start to learn to do that well.
Right. And I think a lot of them, unless you are on the phone bridge, you don't even realize that you can't be heard. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
The people that work at home remotely fairly often, when they're in the office, they speak up loudly. They're like, I know that it's hard to hear when you're on the other end of this call.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so you sort of bring what you learned, the struggles you have at home into the office, and then you make it better for who's ever listening in.
Absolutely.
Well, Justin, this has been great. Let's take a quick break. And when we come back, I want to focus on some of the lessons that you've learned in your working remotely.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to check out the show notes at thecareerq.com, where you can also subscribe to the podcast and sign up for our newsletter.
Welcome back. We're talking with Justin Meads, who has been successful at working remotely for the past 10 years, and he's giving us some of his best tips and tricks. Justin, before we left for the break, we were chatting about some of the ways to be successful. Give me some of the lessons that you've learned working remotely. What are some of your best tips and tricks?
For me to be successful, I am like a list person, and so I like to have everything listed out, what I'm going to try to do, short-term, long-term. I like to have well-defined tasks. Over the summer, we're having a problem on one of our releases where they kind of had an ambiguous idea of what they wanted, but hadn't tacked it down really well. For a week or two, I was really frustrated. I was the angry guy on the call just because I need, and I think part of that is the remote working, is I need well-defined, well-chunked out tasks in order to complete them. And so once we figured that out, that kind of smoothed things out. I got back to being happy, Justin. For me, I think it's important to have a secluded work environment. 90% of the time I'm at home alone. My son is at school, my wife's at work. But there's times like over the Thanksgiving break where my son was home the entire week. And he's old enough now that he doesn't need me looking after him. He's up playing Xbox most of the day. But it's still nice to be able to close the doors to the office, and he's doing his thing. I'm able to focus, concentrate, do the things that I need to get done. I think those are the important things for me.
And when we talked about earlier, sort of you doing the conference calls or the Google Hangouts, and you mentioned you get up early, right, at 5:20. Like, how ready are you? Are you somebody that gets up and you're showered and you're actually dressed and you're ready to go for a work day, or are you hanging out in your PJs? Like, what's your MO there?
Yeah, I am sweats and T-shirts all winter. I change it up in the summer to shorts and T-shirts, and that works well for me. I have another friend that works remotely, and I just found this out like a year ago, and it blew my mind. He gets up every morning. He does the full shower. He changes into the clothes that he feels like he would wear at the office if he went into one, and he's an analyst, and so he's thinking pretty uptight. He puts on dress clothes, shoes, the whole thing, and for him, that's how he gets into his headspace for doing his job. But for me, I'm all about the shorts and T-shirts. That's one of the many advantages to working from home is the limited wardrobe, and I love that.
Awesome. What about when you get on the Google Hangouts? Are you still in your T-shirt and sweats, or do you ever spruce it up?
Well, so that just barely started happening last week, and I'm feeling like I'm going to have to take it up a notch. Me wearing my, worn out, stretched out T-shirt probably isn't going to work well on those.
At least on the days you have the Hangouts. Are those every day now that you have a Google Hangout? So every day you might have to get dressed up?
They do 4 days a week that they do that, and then 1 day a week they do it just via Slack, the same questions you would answer in person, you just do via messaging.
Nice. Okay. And then what about you talked about your secluded sort of work environment. So what does that look like? Is that a separate room in your home? How have you set that up?
In our current place we live, we have an office at the front part of the house, has closing doors on it, completely separated from the rest of the house. And that works pretty good. When we lived in Canada and I was full-time remote, my office was it was a smaller house, so it was just a corner of our bedroom. And that worked out pretty good most of the time because, like I said, my wife was away from work, and so when I was home, I had the bedroom to myself. The only times I felt bad was for my wife's benefit, because we would do quarterly releases at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I'd have to go do those in the corner of the bedroom, and she just slept through them mostly.
She didn't even know what was going on in the corner, the greatness that was happening over there. So here's the question. Sometimes when I'm on calls with folks, and you're right, you hear the fire engine goes by or the dogs start barking. How do you manage that, or what do you think about that?
Honestly, I don't even think about it. I just assume that they know, that that's going to happen. My neighbor's got the lawn service over, and they're hacking at shrubs and stuff like that. That's just going to bleed through some.
Just going to. All right. And so then besides work during your workday, what else do you do? Like, are you somebody who does the laundry and cleans the house? Like, what other great things do you get done around the house?
Absolutely. I am, especially as we're doing this call here, I'm up pacing in my office here. I find, it's brutal for me when I'm in the office those 2 days a week and we have those meetings and it's just hours of sitting at the table. I'm like, how do people do this? It's so much. I find myself to be more engaged and wider awake if I'm up moving around, folding laundry, starting a load of laundry, straightening the pillows, kind of because my house is my office and I'm pretty much here at least 23 hours a day. I like to have the living room and the kitchen picked up so that, I don't know, it just makes me in a better headspace if I don't walk in and go, oh, why is that not where it's supposed to be? And so, I'll straighten the house after I get rid of the family in the morning, and conference calls, definitely laundry and other things like that.
One of the things I remember you talking about when you were, I think it was on a previous working remote situation, is taking yourself out to lunch.
Yes.
And tell me about that. I remembered was that a weekly thing, and why did you do that?
That was a weekly thing, and that was just to keep my sanity. That was one of the jobs where I was full-time remote, and like I said, being in the house 23 hours a day, that just was, my threshold. So once a week, I just made it a point, okay, it's only an hour, go out, get some food, clear the mind, and that worked really well for me. I think now that my son's a little bit older and I'm taking him to soccer practice and I'm going in the office those 2 days every other week, I haven't found it as important to do that now. I feel like I'm getting enough outside the house time that isn't as important. But I imagine if I went back to another job that was full-time remote, I would definitely adopt that again.
And it's interesting, those things that you come up with, right, just to make it a more workable situation for you, because it can get lonely, I imagine.
So I told you I was doing the 2 or 3 days remote, and then I went full-time remote for about 2 years. We moved at that point again, and when we moved, I was like, okay, I've done this full-time remote thing for 2 years. I want to go back into an office. And I did that for about 13, 14 months, and then the old job came calling again with another full-time position, and because of a number of different things, I was like, you know what, the first 6 months back in the office every day was pretty awesome, but after that, it turns out working from home's really, really awesome, and have been doing it ever since then again.
That's great. And then when that job came a-calling again, was it specifically a working remote? So it was an old company that you had worked remotely before, and that's what they were looking for again?
Yeah, it was actually the original team, the first team that I'd worked remotely on. I kept in contact with one of my friends one day a week when I was driving into the office. I'd call him, and one day he was like, hey, that one boss that nobody liked? He's no longer our boss, and would you think about coming back? And I'm like, sure, I'd think about it.
Neat. I mean, I love that these opportunities, just sort of pop up really from your networking. You've maintained your network, It sounds like, and then these opportunities come your way.
And I think too, that with time, there's been more and more opportunities for remote working. Like I said, there's now 4 of us that were on that original team that work full-time remote. I've got a friend in the health insurance industry. He works full-time remote. He leads a team. He has a team of auditors. I think he's got like 12 or 13 people, and his entire team works from home full-time. My other friend that dresses up nice, like I said, he's a business analyst kind of guy, and I just think there's more and more opportunities, and I think it's the way, I don't know. You can't do it for every job probably, but there are a lot of jobs where it makes no sense for you to sit in traffic an hour each way every day.
Right. And especially then if you can, if you've got one of those jobs and you can propose something like this. And I love that in your first group or at your first company, it was a couple days a week. And it was just the nature of the company that's something they allowed and the type of work allowed for it. But then it can evolve into a full-time work remote to save yourself any kind of commute time in.
Right. Absolutely.
Well, so what are some of the cons that you've experienced from working from home?
Some of it, like I said, I don't miss a lot of the minutia of what's happening in the office and the politics, but some of that you do miss out on. Sometimes like a colleague, we just had a colleague that went out on maternity leave, and I thought it would have been cool if I had been in the office when they had the party for her, and some of that you end up missing. But really, cons, for me, I feel like there's been very few cons. I'm fairly solitary kind of person. I don't mind. I think if you were a super social person, it might be hard not to have that daily interaction, or you'd have to find another way to get that. But for me, I'm pretty okay just hanging out by myself, getting stuff done, and yeah, the list of cons is short for me.
Do you think it's impacted your career trajectory?
I don't know. I feel like with my current job where I am now, I feel like I'm in a pretty good place. And I think part of it, I mentioned earlier that we followed my wife's careers over the years, and that's because she had much higher ambitions than I did. She wants to be a VP and that kind of stuff, and I absolutely don't want that at all. I love computer programming. I would be miserable if I didn't have a job where every day I was sitting down and coding. And off this project that I'm just transitioning off of, like they hired me just to be a mid-tier Java programmer, and then I was able to say, hey, we've got this third party that's doing this really cool JavaScript front-end work stuff. Seems like one of us in the office should know this. And they're like, sure, why don't you jump on that? And so I transitioned to a different part of the project, learned a ton, and then we had other personnel changes, and I started, for no reason, managing other people, but doing the good managing. I didn't have to do like reviews and any of that kind of stuff, but helping to answer questions, direct work. I think this would be a good task for this person to work on. I think if we move this person here and then we do this, and so it's been, I've really, really liked kind of that team leady, but still, the majority of my day is coding kind of thing. So for me, I feel like my career is in the place where I want it to be.
Good. That's great. And then you are in a location where you want to be, which is your home, right? You can be there, and because you've tilted.
I feel so fortunate that every day for pretty much my son's entire life, I've been there when he's left in the morning, and then I've been there when he gets home at night. And I love being around all the time and hearing what his day was like, and you get that otherwise, but I don't know, it's just different than I've always been there for those two events.
So we've talked a little bit about some of the tools and technologies you're currently using on your current role with the Google Hangouts and Slack and Jira. What are some of your favorite sort of tools that enable you to work remotely? Like, what are some of your favorite things that if you could design your whole team to use them, what would those be, you think?
I think when I first came on, we weren't using Slack, and I was able to convince them to give it a try, and we've been using it for the last year and very successfully. So Slack's a great one. Google Hangouts works, but I don't know that it's the best messaging protocol. Part of Slack, we use Screen Hero to share screens when we're doing code reviews amongst a couple of developers. That works well. I think those are the big ones, just the communication tools. Jira is awesome for tracking tasks. We get a lot of, good use out of it. Confluence, we use Confluence to do more stationary requirements and tracking of business knowledge, where a lot of Jira is more transient knowledge of the domain.
I've started working with a company doing some consulting work with them, and we use something called Basecamp as a collaboration tool that's been pretty interesting and pretty effective in, you can start streams and you can start conversations in there, but you can also store documents, and I've been pretty impressed with that one as well. Have you had any experience with that one?
I have not.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to Google it. Take
Yes.
a look.
Yeah. Look up Basecamp. Then the other one that I've used with another thing was Trello, which is, you sort of create little cards and tasks. It's a bit more of like a project management quasi-system. But that one's pretty interesting. You talked about liking to make lists. This one, you sort of make cards, and then you can move cards into different columns, whether it's done and stuff. So that might be another interesting one to check out.
I think, that's kind of what we're using Jira to do as well, where we create our stories and then they're in queue, in development, in testing, kind of move them through the different streams that they're in.
Yeah, obviously. Sounds good. Hey, well, this has been a fantastic conversation, Justin. What I want to do now is transition you into some of our standard questions that we ask lots of our guests. And they're kind of fun, a little bit off the specific topic about working remotely. But Justin, what was your first job?
I think my first job was flipping burgers at Wendy's.
Awesome. So did you learn anything from that you think you still use today?
I think something that's kind of stuck with me is that it turns out that I'm pretty good at flipping burgers. And with Wendy's, there's the whole anticipating, because everything's cooked fresh, there's nothing prepackaged. And when you're back there running the grill, you have to kind of estimate how many burgers to do and all this. And it turns out, like I said, that I did a pretty good job of that, and that when I went to my managers when it was time for me to leave that job and was getting ready to resign, they were like, no, but you do a really good job. And them having that confidence in me, and I don't know, I was just a young kid, and so for them to say, hey, you do this job well, and we really appreciate your work, I don't know, that always kind of stuck with me and has given me confidence that I can do other jobs and that I am pretty good at what I do.
That's great. Because what were you, 16, 18 when you had that
16.
job? 16. Yeah, right. So you went in and you clearly didn't have much burger flipping experience before that, right? But you were able to go in and be successbe able it.
Exactly. And my boss was like, oh, don't leave. Please don't leave. I just kind of like, I must be able to do things well,
Yeah.
Because up to that, your first job is your first real-world feedback that's not some test or something that you're doing in high school. It's, these people, lots of times would be like, oh, wow, I'm glad that dude's leaving. So that they didn't have that attitude, it just has given me confidence that I've carried forward.
Nice. I love that. Well, so have you read or listened to anything recently that you'd recommend to others?
Probably nothing useful. We watched Stranger Things on Netflix. Love that. So good. I've heard there's this great new Career Q podcast. Listened to a couple of those recently.
Awesome. That is a great thing to listen to for sure, Justin. All right. So what would your 90-year-old self say to you today? If 90-year-old Justin walked in your door, what do you think 90-year-old Justin's going to say to you right now?
I hope he says, keep doing what you're doing, that you're on the right track and things seem to be going pretty well. So, don't mess it up too much. I had an experience where we moved out of country and I wasn't able to work while we were overseas. And it turned out that I was miserable. It was the first time since my job at Wendy's when I was 16-year-old that I didn't have a job. And I clearly do not have enough hobbies. And I discovered then that I pretty much plan to work until I am that 90-year-old guy. So I'm hoping he comes back and he says, you're doing good, keep doing what you're doing. We're happy here at 90 and we're still coding.
Nice. I love that. Still coding at 90. That's the goal. Who knows what language that will be in or, what technology that will be on.
Exactly. Some weird VR, touchscreen thing from, some movie.
Right. Maybe it's a chip implanted in your head. You'll just tap your forehead.
Yes, exactly. Neural implant.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Justin, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for chatting with me about how you've been successful at working remotely.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be on.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. Be sure to head on over to thecareerq.com where you can get more information, show notes, and related articles to today's topic. Also, if you like what you're hearing, head on over to iTunes, subscribe to the podcast, and make sure you leave us a rating and a review. We'd love to hear your feedback. Thanks again.
The Career Q podcast is produced by Lens Group Media and recorded at Jack Straw Cultural Center in the lovely Seattle, Washington.